for like average news people, it's a really, really difficult thing to understand what is going on a very basic level. And I don't know whether that's like a platform problem or whether that's news operations that operate within a platform logic.
Hello and welcome to Tech Won't Save Us. I'm your host, Paris Marks, and after Russian tanks and military vehicles rolled into Ukraine last week, and all of a sudden it seemed like we were consumed with following what was happening in this part of the world through social media, through traditional media, and there was so much conflicting information in such a short period of time in the fog of war, as many people call it. I wanted to have a conversation about what was going on there and what social media and the way that the internet is affecting traditional media is affecting our ability to understand what is going on in this conflict and other, important major events beyond this war as well. So this week I have two guests who are experts on social media and the content economy. The first is Ryan Broderick, the writer of the Garbage Day newsletter and host of Content Minds. And second is Hussein Kesvani, the writer who's written for a ton of different publications and the co-host of Trash Future and 10,000 Posts. In this conversation, we get into what it has been like for this past week. At the time we spoke, it was just about 5 days into this war, and what that was like on social media, what it was like to see all of this content being produced, and how it was like regular people were wading into this information war being conducted by the two powers on opposite sides of this conflict, but also, people and states and institutions who were supporting either side as well. Russia pumping out pro-Russian information, but particularly in the English language, the Ukrainian side of things, the Ukrainian government and organizations that supported Ukraine pushing out pro-Ukrainian information as well. And again, even though we have that conception that things that come from Russia are inherently, misinformation and incorrect, and things that come from Ukraine are correct and true, that's not exactly the case, right? There are falsehoods and exaggerations on both sides as they are trying to win over public opinion and get us to empathize with and support their side of this conflict, their narrative for why it makes sense for them to be doing what they're doing. And naturally, I think it's fair to say and obvious to say that it's absolutely terrible what is happening in Ukraine and what the Ukrainian people are being subjected to as the Russian military moves into their country, engages in conflict with their fighters, drops bombs on their city in trying to pursue their military objectives, whatever those end up being. And, I think that there's been a lot of speculation about what those are, but I'm not sure anyone really knows for sure what Vladimir Putin and his, small circle really want to get out of this conflict. So I'm not going to try to assume or make assumptions on this podcast. Before we get into the conversation, though, one thing I do want to note, which I think is important and that we don't discuss in this because we're talking mainly about what's going on social media, but as we see this conflict roll out in Russia and Ukraine, and as we see a ton of sanctions being placed on Russia, that also has other implications for the tech industry and the tech economy. And one of the most crucial of those is obviously we know that Russia is a major producer of oil and gas. There's been a lot of discussion about that in the past week and certainly, for many years, and the dependence of Europe in particular on Russian oil and gas. But what people might not also recognize is that Russia and Ukraine are major producers of some of the resources and gases that are necessary to make semiconductors. And in this moment, I'm sure many people recognize that we have been dealing with globally a disruption to the supply chains of semiconductors for a long time that has resulted in shortages and price increases for certain products like vehicles and graphics cards and things like that. And so this war that is happening between Russia and Ukraine could further disrupt those supply chains depending on how long this goes on and how supply is disrupted for those key materials. Tech Won't Save Us is part of the Harbinger Media Network, a group of left-wing podcasts that are made in Canada, and you can find out more about that at harbingermedianetwork.com. If you like this conversation, make sure to leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. You can also share it on social media or with any friends or colleagues who you think would learn from it. And this conversation with these two excellent guests is free for everybody because listeners like you support the work that goes into making the show every single week. So if you enjoy these conversations, if you feel like you learn from them, you can join patrons like Don from San Francisco, Elizabeth Cooper, and Tante from Berlin by going to patreon.com/techwon'tsavus and becoming a supporter. Thanks so much and enjoy this week's conversation. Ryan, welcome to Tech Won't Save Us.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
I'm really excited to chat with you. And Hussein, welcome as well.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be on this pod.
Thank you. Obviously a big fan of your podcast as well, and Ryan, your newsletter. Everyone should check them out. But we have been dealing with this terrible situation in Ukraine with the Russian invasion for the past week. And I think, it's fair to say that things have just been crazy, and even trying to get some degree of understanding of what's going on through the media channels that we have can be difficult. And that's why I kind of wanted to have this conversation with the both of you about what has been going on, what you've been observing through the social media, the traditional media lens of how we consume information, how we get information, and, just, I think, trying to process the devastating images of what we've been seeing in Ukraine for the past week, the responses to it and the form that those things have taken on social and traditional media has been really difficult, I think, for a lot of people. And so I think before we get into specifics about what you have been observing or specific questions that I have, I guess I just wanted to get general thoughts about what you've been observing the past week, and if there's anything in particular that has stood out to you that you think is really notable.
So I would say that the thing that has stood out to me the most is how quickly the war has been turned into a meme, and how uncomfortable it's been to watch sort of people treat it like the Suez Canal or something. And then for that to happen at the same time that obviously social media has played a massive role in winning the hearts and minds of particularly politicians in Europe to the cause, to defend Ukraine. It's just a really weird example of the bizarre two-way street of social media, opening the conflict up like this. It both trivializes it in a weird way, but then also is revolutionary. It's a really weird headspace to be in all day long looking at it on Twitter.
Yeah, this is a difficult one for me because in some ways, I'm kind of reliving certain things. So I kind of worked for a wire service, a wire news service in 2014 when the first Ukraine crisis happened. So you're introduced to this type of social media environment where you're kind of dealing with a deluge of tweets, articles, lots of misinformation, lots of disinformation. And I think there's a definite distinction between the two. Commentary sort of mixed into it, and all kind of happening across less than free platforms, right? And at the time, I was working in a news job. So it was my job to spend all this time on these platforms, looking through everything and trying to make sense of stuff. And it was horrible. It was a really horrible experience. It was also the year I started doing therapy, which I think the two things are sort of definitely intertwined. It's a lot. And it kind of really affects you physically, emotionally, and so on. And I think the thing that's really been weird is watching everyone I know and everyone online just doing that same job entirely voluntarily.
Yeah, it's so weird.
So, and I kind of look at it on one hand being no, don't fall into this trap because you're not going to be able to get out. But I completely understand why this has happened. And again, this is year 2 of coronavirus related stuff where we've sort of not only been kind of confined in our general worlds of sort of narrowed and we've kind of become a lot more atomized, but crucially, we've become so used to kind of absorbing not just this scale of information, although I would actually say it's even worse now because you have a lot more of it circulating across, again, a handful of platforms. But we now are having to sort of interpret more information than anyone I think is really useful. But crucially, in this environment or this type of social media app, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, as so type of social media apparatus, which is even more driven by surveillance culture as well. And I don't know, you look at it from an opposite, I imagine if I was just someone, well, actually I don't even imagine someone, I could just think of my dad and just someone who's not very online being why do you spend all your time online, man? Why don't you watch the news like a normal person before you go to bed? And it's yeah, that's a good point, but I feel there's an interesting question as to why people aren't doing that, and it's not just about being the main character, whatever. Again, we can talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, it's fascinating. For me, the first few days of this, I was not only ravenously consuming everything that was on social media, but at the same time I was like binging like Al Jazeera and CNN and NBC to like see what the narrative was on the different like news stations as well, and how they were reporting it and like interpreting it. So then like how so many other people were seeing it and trying to understand what was going on. And I think it's really interesting you say like, you know, we've all been dealing with COVID for the past 2 years and how like totalizing that has been, and how that has changed so many, the way that we live, the way that we engage with information. And then all of a sudden it's like, I don't know if you feel this way, but it's like it disappeared. And all of a sudden it's just like everything is the war. And like you don't hear so much about COVID anymore, or at least I haven't been seeing it.
Well, it's a new season of reality. It's a new season. It's a new season of the world cinematic universe that we now live in.
Yeah, it's like the House series where he went to the mental hospital, right? And it's like, oh, okay, we're just here now.
COVID was like the overarching season plot, and then we had like minor subplots like the trucker convoy and critical race theory, but now like we've got a new big bad, because like we consume reality through like a bunch of corporate platforms that make things into weird narratives we have to follow.
The thing I was going to say, though, was that I don't think we're entirely like removed from it. I think that like when COVID news was COVID news, maybe like in early 2020, where like I don't know about other people, but I remember when the pandemic sort of first happened, and I was trying to sort of like understand what was going on. Like other people, like I spent a lot of time on like the virology subreddit, right? And I was like, you know, it was also that time when Joe Rogan actually did like quite a good interview with like a very rare one, like a very good interview.
Hussein, we are barely 7 minutes into this podcast, and you're already plugging Joe Rogan. I just want.
That's right. Look, I want to be on a show. I want to talk about I want to talk about Gundam Seed. Yeah. That's what I want to do. Anyway, look, no.
I think we're gonna have to stop you there and exile you from the show, and it's just gonna be me and Ryan from now on.
Do you know what I mean? I think it was like that time when people were trying to, okay, like what is like, you know, what is this virus, and like what is a pandemic, and what's the difference between a pandemic and like an epidemic, like all these types of questions that were sort of linked to COVID. And then over time, like you know, that kind of like conversation about public health, like, you know, dissolves because it merges into other things until we sort of get to like the end of 2021, where, you know, COVID is still happening, but we're not really talking about COVID, or we're not really talking about Omicron anymore. You know, it's now sort of like become just this big nebulous like term that's kind of encompasses everything and nothing at the same time. And I think for like the Ukraine stuff, like again, like, and this happened really fast, it becomes during that kind of period where we weren't sure whether like Putin was going to go in, you know, you see these kind of conversations about, you know, Russian geopolitical strategy and like the history of kind of like Crimea in relation to like, you know, the former like Soviet republics and everything. And like, it's remarkable now how it's like lots of conversations that I see across both like my main feed, but also the lists I kind of have, but not really about that anymore. It's much more about like this kind of broader existential dread. And like, I think the kind of connective tissue between all this stuff is just like the past few years, like trying to understand what this feeling of existential dread actually is. And that kind of is located in so much. It's located in like global politics. It's also located in like the degradation of the global economy. You know, it's located in like pop culture and like the dearth of like art and creativity in terms of its ability to like express like our current condition. So I think there is like an underlying question, but it kind of it's really difficult to define, not only because of how much information is like sort of thrown our way and like, you know, that's difficult to interpret, but just the fact that like I think this moment is very difficult to interpret.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the topics I want to come back to will kind of relate to that. But Ryan, I wanted to get to something that was in a recent issue of Garbage Day that you wrote, where you discussed how, you know, war is not new in the way that many, you know, commentators have been saying when they've been saying like, oh, you know, this war is happening in civilized Europe. Like we haven't seen anything like this before. But as you note, our TV and social media for as long as it's been around has been filled with war for decades, right? But it feels like something is different in this moment, right? As we're consuming this war for the past week and everything that has been going on with it. Why is that? And what stands out about it to you?
So, yeah, in that Garbage Day issue, I sort of compared the propaganda war between ISIS and America. And like ISIS, for better or worse, like created like a new form of info war that we had never really seen before, where they were basically like breaking through the walled gardens of Western social media platforms and posting like beheading videos or footage of them like parading around with AK-47s or whatever it was. And they would use that as a way to intimidate people, but also to recruit a decentralized terror network, which, you know, they were able to bring a lot of SoundCloud rappers from the UK to Syria, which is very impressive. And like that, for better or worse, was up against this monolithic American pop culture machine that was nonstop, you know, American sniper style, everything about the war. We're America, we're the best. And ISIS couldn't obviously compete with something like that. But what's happening right now, and I think it's what is tripping up a lot of pundits, is that for right now, and we're recording this on Tuesday, March 1st, Ukraine has internet connectivity, and Ukraine's internet presence is in some ways actually bigger than Russia's, but at least right now their connectivity is about equal.
Yeah, in the English language, right?
For sure. And there's a lot of conversation about like, why isn't Russia's info war better? And it's like, well, Russia is doing an info war, but they're focused internally. They're focused on trying to quell division inside Russia. Meanwhile, Ukraine is using social media to essentially, I think The Verge described it as a force multiplier, theverge.com. And it's a great concept where it's like, Ukraine is small. It is a civilian army. It's full of like underground, like people's army, cyber warfare stuff, but they're able to multiply that feeling across the entirety of the internet. And so we are seeing two like fairly equal connected nations battling each other. And it's totally bizarre. And I think it's actually like causing mental distress for people who watch it, because they're saying like, well, wait, how is this any different than what I've seen in Palestine then? Wait, or how is this any different than what I've seen in Hong Kong or China? Or how is this different than the Vietnam War? Like once now we're seeing two equally connected nations, the absurdity and the horror of war, I think, is almost incomprehensible, because now you're like, wait, like I can see inside these countries as they're fighting. I can watch a Ukrainian steal a tank with a tractor on Twitter. And like, that is mind blowing to me. And it makes me think like, you know, like what would the Vietnam War have looked like if the Viet Cong had Twitter or TikTok and they were able to post, like, I mean, but these are absurd things to say, but at the same time, like, think about it. Think about how different history would be if two opposing forces were able to use this technology this way. And so to go back to like what I had said at the very top of the show, which is like, it's uncomfortable because I don't want to watch war content on TikTok. Like I don't want to see like soldiers doing dances around, you know, military equipment and stuff. But part of me thinks it's also revolutionary and incredible. It's very strange.
Yeah, just 2 points on that before I let you respond, Hussein. And that's, you know, on one hand, you can understand why Ukraine is so focused on the English language info war, right? Because Russia is focused internally or also on the people in Ukraine, trying to get them on its side. Whereas Ukraine, as you say, is small. It needs to win over the West and Western public opinion and politicians to support it in this war, or it faces much less of a chance against Russia, right? And on the other part, where you're saying how social media in this moment feels like, you know, what it is offering to this war, how we see this war, how we understand it, offers a new way of perceiving that. You know, it reminds me to the past, right? The importance of film in previous wars and how that was used as a propaganda tool to create a narrative of war, the way that radio was used in war in World War II, the way that television was used in the Vietnam War, and how that was used in a way to communicate what was actually going on there and gave people a different insight into war and helped to fuel the opposition to the Vietnam War, right? And so you can definitely see how it's in that kind of larger historical trajectory of communication and media technologies being used to, I don't know, show what war looks like.
And I'll say one more thing before Hussein jumps in, because I want his thoughts on this, which is that, so as of today, there are over 500,000 Ukrainian refugees at the border of Ukraine and Poland. And that connectivity, I think, is about to have the exact same effect on that refugee crisis and throwing that into like a bizarre perspective when, you know, you have Europe in the Mediterranean, you know, arresting captains of boats who don't let refugees in. Meanwhile, we're going to have the most connected online refugee crisis of all time so far happening at the exact same time. And I think the same kind of cognitive dissonance we're seeing with people saying like, wait, occupation can be bad is going to be happening with the refugee crisis as well.
So okay, I don't want to like dismiss it because I don't think it's like, number one, I think Ryan's a lot like has a lot more of experience like seeing this stuff than I do. And also just like because it's the internet as well, like, you know, you can't really just dismiss anything because most of the time you can be wrong. However,
Yeah.
my kind of cynical position on this is that like, okay, there are some parallels, right? So I did like a tweet that got more attention than it should have done, and there were a lot of people kind of like quote tweeting me, being like, you know, this is just like a boomer take. Like wars have always been memed, and like, you know, television, radio, movies, pop culture, like all been informed by war. Like, you know, there is no difference here. And I think that like I see where they come from, but I think it's incorrect because like the difference here, like, and to put it in like the most reductive terms, the difference here is like content, right? I don't think it's the same as like radio shows. I don't think it's the same as like movies that are kind of intertwined and like integrated within like a propaganda machine. I don't think they're like TV shows. I don't even think they're really like Marvel movies, to be honest, right? I think Marvelization and Marvel as like a production house are like two different things, not least because the latter does have like ties with the like US military and industrial complex, right? I think that content, and crucially user generated content that these platforms like need and require in order to survive, is really like the crucial difference here. And yeah, on the one hand, there could be like revolutionary potential, right? Because you have like this huge amount of like really connected and crucially like quite social media savvy people. And I don't like using that term. So what I mean by savvy is like people who can like interact with the West in a way that it recognizes.
They're on LinkedIn. You're saying they're all networking on LinkedIn.
Yeah, they know how to do like a good LinkedIn post. They recognize the Spider-Man meme, like, you know, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
They know how to like interact with Westerners in a way that like I don't think other refugees living like in the Middle East or like living in parts of Africa like were necessarily able to do. So maybe there might be like a smoother communicative exchange with that. The problem with like, in my opinion, but level of scale and like just the fact that there is too much, it kind of, again, it goes back to like abundance, right? And when you have like an information abundance, like channeled through platforms where you already have too much content and it's already really difficult to like interpret stuff, what ends up happening, I think for like a lot of people, they become exhausted or they become like confused or they don't really know like how to interpret it and like that type of stuff. And crucially, like if you're going to talk about Russian information wars and what they're very good at, like the thing that's like the Russians have always been very, very adept at in terms of understanding the internet from like a very cynical perspective is just like the effectiveness of just filling the hole up with shit. Like they sort of know that abundance is part of like a disinformation strategy. It's like a disinformation weapon, right? And it's a way of like basically getting people to become apathetic because crucially, like rather than sort of being focused on like what is currently happening or like the kind of crisis that's taking place, if you sort of play it out for longer scale and like people in the West realize that, oh, this doesn't really pose an existential threat to me in any sort of direct way, they kind of lose attention. And that could ultimately be a problem for Ukrainians for whom like the information war is very much like the war that they're winning right now. Like, again, it goes back to like content ephemerality and just the idea that like information wars can be very, very effective in a very limited way, but played out on a longer scale, not so much. And I think, again, and I will try and make this very quick, like I think refugees is a really good example of this. I think like war content, you know, it's like loud, it's quick, and it's like, you know, it's very shocking. And when you watch it, it's like, you know, you feel very moved by it. You know, you can feel like very physically disorientated by it. I think with like some refugee stuff you can, but like, I don't know, like looking at the fallout of the refugee crisis in 2015 and how that kind of went from like this being this like mass movement or this mass kind of like call to bring in refugees after the death of Aylan Kurdi, you know, only for like a few months later to kind of look at these, you know, for respectable tabloids and broadsheets to look at like crowds of people at borders and being like, you know, these are invaders or these are people who like will like corrupt our communities and like we need to keep them in camps. Like it was remarkably quick how that transition happened. And I don't necessarily think that will be avoided for Ukrainians just because they happen to be like whiter Europeans, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm terrified of what happens when the world loses attention. Platforms like Facebook and Twitter are fueled by that. So like eventually this will be like a thing we all remember. And that is a terrifying idea to me.
Yeah. Or it'd be one of those things where you look back on it and you're like, oh, remember like those few weeks when we really cared about like the Ukrainians and everything. So like, and I don't know, like maybe like the Ukrainian government or people in Ukraine like know about this, right? You know, they were in Europe and like, you know, they were affected by the refugee crisis in the same way that like other Eastern European countries were. Maybe they're aware of that ephemerality and have a strategy for that. My kind of thinking is just like when it comes to platforms, and when it comes to platforms that depend on like such high volumes of user generated content, in order to kind of maintain that attention and to maintain that urgency is a really, really big task. I mean, like a really contemporary example of that is Black Lives Matter, right? Where like, you know, that movement is still going on, and like I very rarely kind of see that happening on like my main feeds, and like even feeds where, you know, I follow people who were very, very active in that, right? So I just wouldn't discount that. And I kind of think that like for all the effectiveness in information war is right now, like it historically kind of tends to be very short-lived. And I imagine that like the Russians certainly know that.
I think that's really fascinating, right? To think about how long this is actually going to last. How long can you maintain people's attention and keep them caring about this topic? Because, you know, we've seen it many, many times before, how the attention drops off, as you're saying, Ryan and Hussein. I'm also interested in what we have been seeing in this short term, though, right? And as you're saying, Hussein, kind of the incentives of the content economy on that. Because since the war has broken out, you know, there have been stories about misinformation spreading on TikTok, the same happening on Instagram war meme pages. We can see the information war happening on Twitter very clearly with pro-Russian stuff and pro-Ukrainian stuff being spread. Sam Biddle had a story about how Facebook rolled back a 2019 ban on the neo-Nazi Azov battalion, which is part of the Ukrainian military, now allowing people to praise that group, whereas they weren't allowed to before. And, you know, we have a lot of problems with Facebook and, you know, right-wing stuff. But what are we seeing in these instances? And what incentives does the content economy create that affects our ability to, I guess, understand this, but also creates incentives to spread particular kinds of information?
My first reaction to that is just that, like, we feel like we need to spread it. Like, social media functions unlike TV or radio because you only see things because other people have posted it or shared it. And like that is a completely disorienting thing with regards to war content. And like the fact that like all of these social media platforms are participatory, I think is creating this bizarre world where everyone feels like they have to have like the Ukraine take. And it's become like a punchline where it's like all the COVID guys on Medium are pivoting to be like war guys, right? And it's true. It's the same with like fandoms. It's the same with QAnon. It's like if you're on the internet, you feel like you have to engage with the trending topic du jour. And right now that is a literal land war in Europe. And that is absolutely bizarre. And it's why you're seeing people be like, Zelensky is making me horny, and why you're seeing like Avengers Endgame memes and like, oh, I saw one today that was like a very chipper how to prepare for the nuclear apocalypse preppers guide. And it was like cute, fun things you can do to prepare for like nuclear war. And it's like, oh, we all just have to have like a content strategy that now has to fit around World War III. It's goofy. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like having a strategy for getting your podcast out on schedule during a nuclear fallout is really important. Right?
Hussein, I'll be very honest with you. Of all media forms, podcasting will be the least affected by nuclear war. There'll be you can do that.
That's right.
Bunker,
yeah, we're protected.
That's right. Because I mean, like I already do it from my basement anyway, so it's pretty chill. No, I think you're right. Like, and that Paris, that's like a big question. So I'm sorry if like I don't kind of touch on everything.
That's okay.
But yeah, you're right. Like, again, it goes back to like one element of this I've been thinking about is like the way in which like these platforms have kind of like commodified all the information and centralized it on their platforms means that like everyone who's sort of consuming information and the way that lots of people consume information through like the internet kind of like is very similar to how you would do it if you were like working in a newsroom or if you were like a social media manager or something, right? It feels like a very, you know, that's the default way of like understanding information. And again, like I don't know how common that way is or whether that's just kind of something that a particular kind of person who is like sort of news information adjacent does. So I've been kind of wary of like projecting that as like a mainstream experience. But then I also think about like the news economy more broadly, and like, you know, I remember like when the Guardian live blog kind of came out, and that was like this kind of new and innovative thing of, you know, rather than having news being updated like, you know, a couple of times during a day on a website, like the live blog and like the team that was on the live blog would be working round the clock to like update everyone with like information. The first time I remember using it was during the 2012 US presidential election, where the live blog was kind of like used as a way of calling out states. So you could watch the election play out in real time, right? And it felt like this really, really amazing thing. And then it was used during the so-called Arab Spring and like, Syrian revolution and stuff. And now what's really interesting is that like everything's a Guardian live blog, right? But it's not even just like the live blog in terms of like, here's the news and like, here's what our news team has reported. It's like, here's a mixture of all this stuff that ranges from news and commentary and things that are kind of a mixture of both and things that have some truth and don't have some truth in it. And by the way, like, you're going to have to figure this all out yourself. And like, I think this is also one reason why you see lots of people acting as if they're like working in newsrooms, like ordinary people are being like, check your sources.
Oh
and
my
like,
God. I think that is such a ridiculous, like, how have we gotten this insane where it's like, oh, hey, average person, it's your responsibility to not share stuff that's wrong. It's like, why? Why is it your like, that's ridiculous?
Right. And again, this is a platform problem, right? Where it's like these platforms can't work in a traditional, like, they can't really institute like moderators in a way that you would kind of associate them with platforms and stuff, right? So like on the one hand, they've got these moderators that are really there to like try like take out like the worst possible content. And like, I don't know what their success rates are, but like the fact that a lot of kind of like quite gruesome stuff like bleeds through quite often would imply that like it's a much more difficult job to actually do that than it actually is. But then when you have like things that don't necessarily cross that boundary but are still like bits of misinformation or things that are quite gruesome or things that are just like inappropriate, like that stuff, because it kind of exists in that nebulous form of like content, it's technically like allowed and there's no kind of like real kind of rules or regulations against it. And I think that like the way we interpret that in terms of how we access and just like understand information relative to like ourselves and our existence, like it just makes it a lot more tricky. Like even trying to describe it is quite a difficult thing to do. And in terms of like platforms and content and like platform incentives and stuff, well, I think on a very basic level, again, because these platforms rely on so much user generated content, the incentive is very much, if you have this like shitty opinion that doesn't make sense, absolutely post it, because like you'll get loads of engagement. And like, Twitter is a really good example of like, encouraging the worst possible takes, and like the worst take you post, like the more engagement you'll get, because, worst case scenario, you'll get like a load of people dunking on you and you get loads of attention for that. And crucially, like bear in mind, there are some people that really like getting that attention, right?
You do, right? That's why you tweet the way you tweet? Is that?
Yeah, fuck. Yeah, I mean, look, no, I don't like it. I don't like it at all. But there was a time where
I think we all know the kind of people you're talking about, or I would hope so.
Yeah, like there are people who really like that kind of attention, or like find it really fascinating to sort of get that attention. And again, it's like one of those things where you will get more attention if you post your sort of like impassioned takes. There are like war journalists or like kind of like people in Ukraine right now who are kind of doing so-called war journalism, who are like posting anecdotes and like highly personalized, like posting selfies from war zones, right? I'm not going to like name names, but like, I kind of look at it, I'm just like, oh, is this like really what you should be doing? But again, the platforms like reward that. And like now, because of, stuff like, PayPal, Patreon, and so on, you can do that at a really, really personalized level, right? There are kind of reporters in Ukraine right now whose like funding for like whatever they're doing is being paid by patrons who like aren't really kind of paying to like, hear what the report is in Kiev or whatever, because there's so many reports from Kiev. They're just like paying for that person to be there to kind of post stuff. And I think that's like a really scary and unhealthy thing, and one that like we haven't sort of seen like the full implications of. But this is like crucially when we talk about why is this war different from other ones, it's like, well, I think this is the first time like you're going to see that type of personality, that like influencer slash like journalist, whatever you want to call them, like as a kind of like mainstream figure in the information economy.
So I think we're thinking of the same person. So on one hand, like part of me thinks that's interesting because this war is happening at a time where like major media brands have eroded to a degree that they've never been like this. Like most American digital outlets, unless they are one of two major newspapers, like they can't send someone there and they can't really even respond to it properly. So obviously I think that you're going to see people going there. We talked about this earlier in the podcast. We don't even really know what type of time frame we're talking about. And so like when Hussein and I worked together, I used to be sent to immediately report on European terror attacks. I did a lot of them. I was in Paris the day after the Bataclan. I was in Calais the day they burned the jungle refugee camp. I spent a lot of time doing like breaking news on the ground in Europe. And I've written about this before, but I will never forget being in Nice the day after the truck attack and watching the international news crews leave because there had been a conflict in Turkey. And it was like watching the carnival pack up and move to the next town. And it was just like, I don't know how like this ecosystem we're talking about with the influencers and the people parachuting in and the Richard Engel like getting a super huge boner for World War III and all the rest of this bullshit. How does that function in something like a world war, which America didn't even enter World War II for 2 years? We're on day 5 of this right now, recording this. So like, we can't even conceptualize the length of time for a world war. And who knows, maybe because of social media, like the time is going to be compressed in real life, but like technically this war hasn't even started yet. And so how our media system works with that, I have no idea.
Yeah, it's been interesting as well to kind of see the takes that like, this is something that should have been over and done super quickly and Russia was just going to storm in and take it, or else it's not going to work and they're failing, right? Whereas a war is something that is often quite dragged out. When you look at even what the United States did in Iraq, that was not something that happened overnight. And I think our expectation for it to go really quickly might be influenced by other kind of ideas that we have about speed and time.
Well, yeah. And it's also just like that point of like, well, if you want to talk about like this wasn't just a war that just happened. Like technically it's sort of been going on since 2014. And again, like I remember when like the invasions of like Donbass and Crimea and stuff happened, like you had a very kind of similar response, although like on a smaller scale, where it was just like, Russia is invading like a independent country and a country in Europe. And like, is Europe going to do anything? And, there was like the same kind of berating of people who were like, stop the war kinds of like, you're appeasing Putin and stuff like that. And for about like a month, this was like this huge thing. And it kind of led to like people working for Russian news organizations resigning. And like, I remember like it definitely felt like this kind of like tipping point. And then a month afterwards, people just forgot about it. And then you kind of see these documentaries on like Vice News and stuff, whereas like, they'd send a reporter into Donbass and like, you would just see that, oh, like this war is like has destroyed this entire town. And it's like, rendered so many people like in kind of permanent poverty and like, the kind of sees a resentment and nobody really kind of cares about it anymore. So it's kind of that thing about, well, okay, if you're going to talk about this sort of being a world war, like that began like a long time ago, and I think you just have these sort of like moments that kind of, I don't want to say like wake people up, but it's more just like they kind of remind people that, oh, these kind of like continual forces of history are still existent, so pay attention for it for a bit, but then you'll have like a new thing happen afterwards. And in the same way that like reporting crews like sort of move to other countries, like we turn our attention to other things, and crucially we're in this moment where there is an abundance of things to turn our attention to.
I also think that like the algorithm craves conclusions. It's like the same reason why like every response on a Reddit relationship post is like get a divorce. It's like it's the same like feeling behind like cancel culture, quote unquote, or like any sort of like online movement has to have some kind of ending, because like when it turns out that like when we crowdsource narratives like this, we just assume like, okay, we're all done. Like I've shared all the content, COVID's over. Like, okay, like move on. And for whatever reason, maybe it's a psychological thing, maybe it's something else, but like we just can't really keep our attention long enough to follow something like this. It's too big of an object. It's too complicated, I think.
I'm wondering as well, like in thinking about this content economy and how we're all consuming this information at this moment, we were talking about an info war that is basically going on between these two powers who want to win public opinion, win support by utilizing what's going on online. And I think we can see in recent years, obviously, how social media has been used to propel, misinformation, conspiracy theories, things like that. What are we seeing in this moment as there is just like, as you're saying, this kind of deluge of content, of information coming for people? Not all of it is accurate. I guess, what does that mean for how people engage with what's going on?
So my hot take is that like misinformation just doesn't matter anymore. I sort of think that we're over it. And like, I have to believe that human beings are smart enough to like see a TikTok video of like a guy parachuting and vlogging and be like, that's probably not real. Like, I have to believe that, just that, because like if that's not the case, like I'm really scared, like particularly TikTok, because I think everyone's really nervous about like the misinformation on TikTok. But when I think about all of the like insane bullshit that I heard when I was 16 years old about the world around me that I just like never remembered, I wonder if like it's a similar effect where like teenagers are just logging on, they're like, that's weird, and then they just move on. And then with old people, like neither of you are American, so this won't make any sense, but like any American listening who's been to a Thanksgiving ever will tell you that a lot of the old people in your life will just say crazy shit at you, like it doesn't mean anything, and then just not think about it again. And I sort of think that like the majority of the stuff that people see on the internet kind of falls in that bucket, but then like the 10% that like fall for this stuff spend days camping out in like Dallas, Texas, waiting for like QAnon to bring back JFK Jr. So it's like a really vocal minority fall for it, but the rest of us just sort of move on with our lives. But maybe that's just me being too optimistic.
I've been kind of thinking about this a little bit because I'm kind of, I think that like the kind of misinformation crisis has been overstated in the sense that like I think people kind of forget how the like very long history of like misinformation and how like misinformation has shaped a lot of like internet culture, right? Like, so the idea of like trying to sort of combat misinformation online to try like sanitize the internet, for like lack of a better word, is kind of a project that seems to kind of be counterintuitive to how lots of kind of online culture emerges anyway. And it's not to say that like misinformation beats aren't important, or like especially in times like this, for like debunking like obvious bullshit that is like actively dangerous isn't something that should be done. But it's more like the idea of like waging a war on disinformation just sort of feels like the wrong terms of reference. And I kind of also kind of think like memory is like a really important thing too. Like, you know, I've never been to a Thanksgiving dinner where like something like that has happened, but I do come from like a kind of like ethnic minority community that has a history of displacement, right? And a history of movement, and also like has a mother tongue that doesn't really have like a written form. So lots of kind of like familial histories and mythologies and stuff are things that are like probably not entirely or like even close to being true, but they are kind of like important to people in like ways that allow them to sort of understand themselves in reference to the worlds that they're in, especially ones that have kind of been informed by like, you know, histories of kind of like abuse and trauma and so on. Which is to say that I think that like we need to have like a better conversation about why people are kind of compelled, not necessarily towards misinformation, but like misinfo narratives, and like what people are actually in danger of that. You know, so like, yeah, separating like the TikTok teens who kind of see like weird shit, assume that it's from like Ukraine or whatever, but will probably likely forget about it within like a month's time. Because again, like, you know, so much content on TikTok, is very easy to sort of like forget stuff that like you've seen, in the same way that it's very easy to forget tweets, right?
I've never forgotten a tweet. Ever. I think about them all. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, unless you're Ryan Broderick, in which case you remember all of them. But then there's like a minority of people for whom like misinformation narratives, and especially like how those kind of like bits of misinformation feed into like these kind of, you know, narratives of like resentment or pain, or like, you know, these kind of really deep emotions, how they kind of like fit into that. Then we can kind of talk about interventions and strategies and so on. So basically, like, to put it kind of more simply, I think that the way that misinformation beats have kind of been conceptualized has been like a bit too like technical, in terms of like they kind of diagnoses it as a technical problem rather than like a social one, which crucially, like with so much of like, you know, social media management and stuff, like it's that classic thing of like viewing something as like a technical problem that requires a kind of algorithmic solution, then seeing like online culture as kind of not only being embedded into broader human culture, but one that is like very much linked to like people's lived like material experiences.
I mean, two good examples just from like today, like NBC News did like an incredible story. Ben Collins did this incredible story about Russia using deep fake photos of not real people to build like sock puppet accounts. Perfect example of a thing that like should not be happening, and like should be written about and should be moderated out, and like should have never happened in the first place. But at the same time, today I'm on Twitter, and a missile hits what people report to be the TV tower in Kyiv. My entire timeline fills up with reports that they have taken out the TV tower. I saw takes being like, this is what Putin does every time. He did it in Crimea. He did it he takes out the communication center. 10 minutes later, no, it didn't actually hit the tower. It actually hit somewhere nearby. Okay. But because of the angle of the cell phone footage from the apartment. And it's like, yeah, all right. Like, that's just sort of the nature of how this works. And like, I wouldn't want to lose the stuff that allows us to understand things better because of that chaos. And like, I mean, what, like last week, was it like Instagram was putting a fact checking widget on something about how billionaires don't cause inflation? And it's like, oh, really? So this is the solution, is that like these platforms, which can't even moderate themselves, should also be the arbiters of objective truth? It doesn't make any sense.
I think I want to pick up on that, right? Because I think this is something that I have observed as well as all this has been going on the past week. I think it's interesting that, before this all happened, there were these discussions about geopolitics and history and things like that. And then as this war broke out, that kind of flattened, right? As there was the very pro-Ukrainian takes and then the pro-Russian takes, and there wasn't a whole lot of nuance of what was going on. And I think that kind of left a space for things that were pro either side that weren't completely true to really take hold of the public, to really seize on them. The Snake Island story in particular comes to mind, where supposedly there were 13 Ukrainian soldiers. The Russians said surrender. They said fuck off. The Russians bombed them and they all died. That turned out not to be true. The Russians just took them hostage, 80 odd people it actually was. And so I wonder what this kind of does to our ability to understand the conflict, to have a nuanced understanding of what's going on in the conflict, and whether there's a difference between what goes on social media, where I think this stuff is just going to happen, and the responsibility of like the traditional media, I guess, like reporters, to actually be able to cut through what's going on social media and not elevate the kind of stuff that isn't true, that is propaganda. And I don't mean propaganda in a negative sense, just propaganda is in like something that is going to try to win people over to one or another side, right? Because I feel like one of the things I took away from, what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan was the lack of understanding that people had for the history and how that played into those events, right? And you even saw Hillary Clinton, I think it was yesterday, giving an interview where she said, like when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the United States supplied arms to the insurgents in Afghanistan, we should be doing something similar in Ukraine, completely leaving out how the people who they gave arms to in Afghanistan were later the very people who did 9/11 and who they launched a war on terror against for 20 years. And like there are a whole load of consequences from that. And there's a whole load of history leading up to it, from arming Iraq and Iran in the Iran-Iraq war, and overthrowing Mossadegh, and the colonial powers carving up the Middle East. Like there's all this history here that allows you to create a narrative that like the Middle East is this place of like barbarians where everyone's feuding and at war, because you're not allowed to like have the historical perspective that shows you how much Western intervention kind of created that state of affairs, right? And so it's like if you don't have that in the case of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, how can you get a fuller understanding of what's going on there? And is the role of the media then to try to provide that context so people understand? And not to say that that's like drawing an equivalence between Russia and Ukraine. You can still support Ukraine and what's going on there, but it's to try to give people an understanding of what's going on at the moment, instead of just repeating and elevating things that are happening on social media and being shared that way.
Well, first, I agree with you. The U.S. should arm the Azov Battalion. We should give them as many weapons as they want. I think that they are exactly who should be rooting for. Yeah. The Snake Island thing is actually a fantastic example of this, because when I first saw it, I sent it to my mom, because she's like a news junkie. She lived in Europe for a long time. She's retired also. So she's like watching a lot of this. And I sent her the clip, and I was like, and at the time it had just been reported that they said, fuck off. And that was it. And I was like, this is great. Like, check this out. And then like a half hour later, she texts me back. She's like, I think they all died. And I was like, oh man. And in that moment, it was like a perfect encapsulation of like what's wrong inherently with viral media to chronicle a war. Like boardpanda.com should not be doing like the best uplifting moments of the invasion of Ukraine, right? I think we can all agree. That should be done by the magicians instead on Facebook. But then the fact that it then comes out like a day later that they are alive, and that was reported by traditional media, I was like, ooh, that's even like a better example of why this doesn't make any sense. The problem is that like, there's no way that traditional media can keep up with social media. It's done. In the same way that like, we can't really fix the fact checking issues probably at this scale. Like at this scale also, like Jim CNN is not going to be able to keep up with like Patriot Mom and like Christ Warrior and like Hussein and I. Like the four of us in that group chat are going to outrun Jim CNN every time. And so like, I think the role, to sort of like get to your question, like I think the role for media here is closer to a ref, or at the very least, like, I think most news organizations, and like, honestly, I'll be very honest, I am not someone that should be telling news organizations what to do. But if I had one, I would basically be saying, like, what can we put our institutional power behind that an average person on Twitter can't? Like, if people are reporting these things, if they're sharing these things, do we have the money and resources to clear this stuff up and get like a verifiable thing? Obviously, that's like the platonic ideal and not really what happens, and also doesn't take into account the economics of running a news organization, all the rest of it. But that's a really hard question. So I'm going to throw it to Hussein and ask him what he thinks, because I don't have a good answer.
Yeah. If we were running a newsroom, it would be like the newsroom from the newsroom, right?
I want to stand up and I want to tell people where I was the day Osama bin Laden died. I want to stop the whole plane and say, we got him.
I think there was an episode which kind of dealt with this whole idea of like, oh, the internet is saying this. And like, it was a very classic, like, Sorkin thing of like, no, we're the news, God damn it. And we're going to wait until like.
It was Dev Patel's character, and it was the BP oil spill, and it was the first episode. And his character found out about the oil spill, I think, on Twitter first. And then Will McAvoy was like, we're the news. We don't just repeat what we see on the internet. And then obviously the BP oil spill.
Yeah, so we should say that like Aaron Sorkin was right the whole time, and we owe him like big apologies. No, I mean, okay, like actually, like that it's kind of facetious, but there is actually some like bizarrely there is some truth in this, right? Which is that like in the world of that TV show, they basically just kind of said, look, we're rejecting the logic of like internet news gathering. And we're going to do it traditionally, and we're going to do it properly, and we're going to do it in a way that, like, you know, we recognize. And if like it's a bit slower, then that's okay. And it was like a little bit slower, but it was broadly fine. I think like the problem now is that for like so many news organizations, including like legacy news organizations, they have no choice but to sort of like adapt to the logic of the internet, right? And I think like on one basic level, like that's very evident in like the expansion of like misinformation beats, and like, you know, suddenly now like internet culture reporting being taken seriously, even though like there are lots of like gendered problems in relation to that. But like nevertheless, like most newsrooms now have like an internet person, whereas, you know, back in, you know, the kind of early to mid 2010s, that was kind of like an outlier job that you'd either give to like a low paid intern, or like, you know, a woman who is also low paid and most likely an intern. So I think there's this like recognition that news organizations like have no choice but to interact with like the logic of like, you know, online information distribution. That's sort of made worse by platforms kind of consuming all kind of forms of news, which means that even as platforms kind of like say how much they hate like Facebook, Meta, Twitter, like all these platforms, they still have to kind of like play ball with them. And tech companies really just don't give a shit about like how news is distributed, made, like, you know, processed, etc. Which then just kind of means that we're going to like experience these problems over and over again. And I think particularly, I think Chris Sokol-Walker has put out a piece recently, like today actually, which kind of touched on this, which is how like platforms are kind of built in a really sophisticated way in terms of like information distribution, sharing, engagement, etc. Like using TikTok as an example, are just not built for situations like war, where again you have like tons and tons of user generated content that is then reproduced and regenerated and remixed and so on. And where like TikTok doesn't like, and other platforms don't have a way of like meaningfully differentiating that or creating like assemblages in which like people can sort of like understand what's happening on the ground. One other thing that I really want to say, and I'm not sure whether it's like related to this particular aspect of the conversation, but I think it does touch on something that we kind of have been skirting around over this podcast, is also just what people like expect from the news now, which is like seems like a very basic question, but it's one that like is probably worth asking. Because I think the assumption is that, oh, people read the news because they want to like understand what's happening in the world, and they want to be like informed, and they want to be informed citizens, and like more information is kind of a good thing and it's empowering. But like what happens when you not only have too much information, but the more you consume, the less aware you are of like your place in the world or like how you relate to it, right? And then that's where you end up having these insane takes, or like, you know, viral videos of like blonde American women reciting poems about Putin and
Dear President Putin, if I was your mother.
Like or stuff like, you know, oh, can history just like not stop for one day? And like, you know, these very cringe posts where I feel like people have sort of like, they've kind of like done, you know, oh, this is cringe, this isn't about you, you're not the main character. But I kind of see where it comes from, in the sense of like, in trying to interpret information in an environment that makes it extremely difficult to not only know what's going on, but also works in a way that is designed to disorientate like your kind of position. Like there are so many like, you know, of digital news outlets and traditional outlets that are producing like Ukraine news, which go along the lines of this is really important and you should pay attention to it. And like this war has implications for everyone. And it can kind of like, it'll not only make you worse off economically, but now there's like threat of a nuclear war, but also like, you know, you live in like the West and like you have no threat of war happening to you. So like, don't freak out about it. Like, do you know what I mean? It just kind of, I think for like average news people who like aren't kind of adjacent to this environment or don't spend a lot of their time thinking about this, like it's a really, really difficult thing to actually just understand what is going on a very basic level. And I don't know whether that's like a platform problem or whether that's like news operations that believe that like in order to kind of, you know, survive and be successful, they kind of need to like operate within a platform logic that is constantly demanding not only attention, but very specific kinds of attention that are really there to like recirculate that content.
I do think that like Twitter has a weird effect on this because like what's really weird about Twitter is that like it's essentially a message board for current events. Like Reddit is broken up into smaller boards of particular topics and you can make your own topic and then you talk about that topic. And obviously current events might inform how you're using the Pokemon Go subreddit, to use an example of my own life. But like it is largely going to be about whatever that topic is. The thing with Twitter though is that like it has a lot of people who are just there to consume current events. And so it creates like this bizarre culture of like super posters who are in a constant state of agony because their shared interest is just whatever horrible shit that's happening in the world interspersed with like award shows. So like, of course, they're just like miserable. And that's when you get the people like, you know, from their brownstone and Park Slope being like, everyone just needs to calm down, or like, hey, Doritos, can you read the room? And it's like, no, Doritos doesn't need to read the room. Doritos is just here to advertise Doritos, unless Doritos is like doing some sort of weird Ukraine themed advertisement. But like, for the most part, like the people who feel that way on Twitter and are posting these takes and are like in a constant state of agony over the news, part of me is just like, please go outside, just like do anything other than be here, because like clearly you can't handle it. And nor should you. It's an unnatural way to live, I think, to be on Twitter this much.
At the same time, I kind of like, I understand where that impulse comes from, but I also think it's very hard for people like, even, you know, the whole like touch grass, go outside thing. I think it's really hard to like go outside and touch grass and also like not be affected. You know, I live in England, man. Like all the grass is like fucking toxic.
You guys have so much more grass than we do. It's like, it's insane how much more grass you have than we do.
Yeah, that's right. And it's kind
you
of
have
like
grass and public restrooms.
You have to pay for the public restrooms in the UK, though.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, that's why there's so much like discourse about it. But I think like again, it's really hard to sort of go. Like I spent, for example, like last weekend, like, you know, I try to like spend less time online on weekends than like on weekdays, partly because like my girlfriend keeps telling me to. And when we were going out, we went to go like see some friends in the countryside and everything, and like all we really did was just talk about Ukraine, right? Because like what had happened was they had gone to church, and the church service was about Ukraine and like the war. So it's kind of like, even in those types of settings, it's very hard to like really fully switch off, because again, like, you know, there's no meaningful switch off, and like the way that information is conceived of and presented and distributed, and crucially like just the amount of it that's like circulating through the system means that like even when you sort of disconnect, I think this like definitely applies to stuff like ongoing culture wars and everything. Like eventually it does seep into like ordinary discourse. And what happens when like you're confronted with someone who is basically repeating things that you've read on Twitter, and you're kind of like, I don't want to interact with someone as if I am on Twitter, but like now I kind of have to, but in real life. And this is really weird and really disorientating. I don't know whether this person knows that they're saying stuff that came from like Twitter, or like you understand like how the sausage is made, for like lack of a better term. But it also just makes it very difficult to like interact in the real world. I guess like what I'm trying to say is that like, I feel like there are very real like material consequences of this type of information economy. And I feel like it's something that we kind of lack a language for, which makes it very difficult to like sort of talk about like in real life. And even on podcasts like this, where I'm with two very online people, it's very difficult to kind of like articulate that. But it's really, really important, because like it's affecting politics, and it's affecting like economics, and it's affecting like how we live our lives and how we like speak to each other, how we relate to each other, like that lack of separation. But as I said in like that tweet, that is kind of, I like still kind of getting numbers right now.
Okay, you don't have to brag about the numbers you're doing on Twitter, but okay.
Don't worry, everyone. I'll put it in the show notes so you can go see.
Link to Hussein's great tweet. Yeah.
That's right. Like, but what I mean is that like it's kind of really changing the way that like we relate to each other. And I think it's like very different to other forms of mass communication because like of the way that it's happening both faster and also the way that it kind of encompasses into like other trending topics. So this is the idea that like you're not really talking about one thing, you're actually talking about like this whole genealogy of like stuff that exists online and offline but like kind of switch interchangeably. Yeah, it's really difficult to like talk about it. And I think that like a lot of the stuff that we're seeing with this war right now, and like especially because it is like an extremely online war, also just reflects our need to sort of like have a new language or like to update how we talk about the way in which we process, consume, distribute, share information.
Yeah, I think it's such an essential point. And, you know, I hope that as we end this conversation, people's minds are spinning, just trying to think about the implications of that. But, you know, this hour has flown. It's been so great to speak to both of you about what has been going on. I wanted to end by asking if both of you have any final comments or thoughts, anything we didn't get to in the conversation or anything that you think is relevant that we weren't able to discuss.
The reason Hussein's tweet is doing so well is because I linked to it in Garbage Day. I want that to be clear. That, like, that's the Garbage Day effect. So you're welcome. But it was a great tweet. I think my final thought on this is just that like we are so early in something that is both so old and so new at the same time that I want to be like as like definitive and like professional about this as possible. But I'm just like, things are going to be really weird because war is essentially like what I would say the second oldest thing that human beings do with each other. And like the internet is the newest thing that we've ever created. And they're now happening like within each other. And like as weird as the GameStop pump and the crypto boom were for finance, like we're now seeing this exact effect with war. And we're at the beginning. We haven't even like we're day 5. My head is spinning trying to keep it all straight. And what's crazy is like there's so many micro moments happening within this macro moment that like, yeah, I don't know how people are meant to process this. And maybe they just don't. I don't know where we go from here.
I really only have like one thing, and I didn't mention it because number one, like it used to be like Ryan and I's boss, but actually like Jonah Peretti was like right. I don't know whether either of you are like familiar with the essay that he wrote in like the 90s.
The commodification thing.
Yeah, the one where he kind of like it's like about like Deleuze and Guattari and like the reproduction of identity and how like the internet like acceleration and you know again like a lot there's like this very interesting kind of insight into like acceleration theory of the 90s. One of the arguments that he makes in that essay is that like what the internet sort of allows is like constant reproduction of identities. And while this is like very confusing for politics because it means that like it makes it very difficult to kind of pursue any type of like collective action or like inform any type of like holistic political identity in which to kind of like enact any kind of activism, what it's great for is for like companies to kind of reproduce identities and in so doing like create products, right? Create products and services, and by the time like that cycle finishes, like another cycle emerges and so on. And as the internet and as platforms become faster, that process becomes a lot faster as well. And I think it's just something to bear in mind when we sort of see phenomena like this, because ultimately like I think one of the things in that essay that is actually very poignant is the idea that like that process also makes it very difficult for people to really understand not only what's going on but like their kind of own material stakes in any type of, you know, social phenomena. So ultimately, like what this is very good for platforms who are able to kind of like reproduce and regenerate content and in so doing, like allow their users to kind of feel like participants in whatever phenomena is like sort of taking place and like immediately kind of they can switch to like new phenomena. But it's very difficult on platforms to kind of like understand meaningfully like the moments that we're in or like what particular like political moments require. And like that doesn't just apply for war, it applies to things like, you know, activist movements. Like BLM's a really good example of this. It applies to like climate change movements and stuff like that. Yeah, so I would ultimately say to like listeners who haven't read it, like who haven't kind of read this essay, like go read Capitalism and Schizophrenia by BuzzFeed founder Jonah Peretti.
Yeah. Oh, and watch the Newsroom. You should watch the Newsroom too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, do both. Read the essay, then watch the Newsroom. And you'll have like perfect online brain like me.
perfect content recommendations as we end this episode. I'll put the link in the show notes to that essay. Again, I thank you both for taking the time. And I know that all three of us are thinking about the people in Ukraine right now and what they're dealing with and how terrible and tragic that is. So I thank you both so much for taking the time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Ryan Broderick is the writer of the Garbage Day newsletter and host of Content Minds, and Hussein Kesvani is a writer and co-host of Trash Future and 10,000 Posts. You can follow Ryan on Twitter at Broderick. You can follow Hussein at H Kesvani. You can follow me at Paris Marks, and you can follow the show at Tech Won't Save Us. Tech Won't Save Us is part of the Harbinger Media Network. You can find out more about that at harbingermedianetwork.com. And if you like the show and want to support the work that goes into making it, you can go to patreon.com/techwon'tsaveus and become a supporter. Thanks for listening.